Federal Parliament returns here in Canberra on Monday as the Prime Minister seeks to pass tougher hate speech and gun laws. I'm bringing in now the former Home Affairs Secretary, Mike Pezzullo. Thanks for your time, Mike. You were one of those to appear before this snap inquiry to scrutinise the detail. From what you've been able to read, do you think the bill should be passed in its current form?
Not in its current form. I would certainly recommend, as I've thought about it more and I've read into the text, particularly the provisions and the explanatory material, and listened to the expert advice from others who have appeared or otherwise made contributions. I think one overall point, my area of expertise is in security practice. Unless you get the law precise enough that it can then be translated into the materials that the officials, the investigators, the prosecutors then are going to be able to act upon, you've got a problem from the outset. It's a very nebulous, hatred is a very nebulous concept to try to capture. They're trying to do it in law, which they should, but it's just very hard to do. I think there are three areas that could be either tightened or amended in some way. The prohibited hate group scheme is a very good scheme. However, unless you tighten the idea of what hatred is, or serious hatred, which they could do by, I think, further refining the definition. Why are we here, Trudy? The reason why we're here is that, yet again, a radical Islamist extremist act of violence has occurred. So perhaps making a point, not about Islam as a religion, I'm not saying that, but the distortion of a religion, maybe that as an element could be added to the serious hate provisions. That could improve it, I think. Or, in fact, you could actually just bolt the whole scheme onto the Terrorism Act, the terrorism provisions in the Criminal Code, and maybe just expand the definition to include things like glorifying violence that leads to terrorism. That's one set of issues. I think I agree with those who have said, who are more expert in the field, that you don't need a religious defence element in there. I think the idea of using your criminal trial of defence of quotation, I think begs the question, well, why are we giving statutory cover for such a defence? Sure, if someone wants to advance that defence at their trial, let them, and then let's see what the courts make of that. But I think the big area is the free speech concern in the middle. I agree there should be a criminalisation of vilification to the extent that it leads to incitement to violence. I think that's why we're here, because there was a horrible act of violence. I think some of the other ideas that they've tried to put around offence, more subjective notions of feeling intimidated without a limb that connects back to violence, I think that's problematic.
It lowers the bar too much that it is essentially an impingement on free speech.
Look, I think it does. We're here because there was an act of violence. Sure, it might have started with an act of hatred, but we got to an act of violence. So I think as much as possible to help the practitioners with very clear laws that really define as sharply as you can the concepts that sit underneath the legal expression, the tighter you can make that, the better.
In your evidence, you said these changes are implemented by the Home Affairs and other agencies, and that's very significant that they need to have a good grasp on this. Explain why.
Well, the law is the law, but whether you've administered, as I have in the past, the Customs Act or the Migration Act, or colleagues have administered the Tax Act, you still need practice guidance. You need guidelines, reference manuals that the practitioners can then use. So, say, a visa cancellation officer, or say an officer in Home Affairs who's working up a brief for the Minister to list and prohibit a serious hate group. It can't just simply be them reading the statute, the actual law as passed by the Parliament, and then having their own subjective view about what hatred is. You need to look at what the Parliament intended. You then need to turn that into what's called practice guidance and manuals and training. And there's a big infrastructure that sits behind that that's hardly ever seen by the public, but as a former practitioner, I know that if you don't resource that, if you don't train the officers, you're basically going to run the risk of making faulty decisions that are then knocked off in the courts.
I wanted to ask you about the other big matter we've been covering all week, and this is potential intervention in Iran. The US president is still leaving his options open. I feel like there's a bit of strategic ambiguity as to what's going to happen here. Military intervention, as you know, always comes with inherent risks. What's your assessment at the moment of where things stand?
I think as far as President Trump has gone, and you're right, sometimes he uses ambiguous language or an ambiguous posture. Sometimes you think he's pulling back on an issue, and then we wake up one morning and there are B-2 bombers in the sky dropping munitions, as occurred last year, because they go in a different direction and he startles the world. The takedown of the Maduro presidency, the actual capture of Maduro himself, surprised everyone. So that strategic shock is very much part of this president's repertoire. I think on the fundamental issue, regimes such as the Iranian regime, which have had decades to entrench themselves, to vet their key operatives, to vet their armed forces, they're very hard to, if you like, unravel or take down simply by protest in the streets. Yes, protest in the streets, which is very dangerous, particularly in a place like Iran, is an element of it. But if the security forces are basically sticking to behind the Ayatollahs, this regime will not fall. Yeah. It could become very violent. There could be a lot of very distressing scenes that we're all exposed to once the internet starts working in Iran. So I'd hold judgment on what is likely to happen on the ground until we get better intelligence. Obviously, the president himself would have access to the best intelligence that the Americans certainly have, and they've got very good intelligence. But sitting on the outside, I'd want to know what those key institutions are doing. Because if they turn on the Ayatollahs or they say, we're not going to shoot on the people, then the regime's in trouble. And
that could be the leverage point here, that the US might want to be watching for signs that there is a breakaway from the Ayatollahs before taking action. Because when you step back and think about it, how would a limited military strike, if that's what the president is looking at doing, going to actually take out the regime? And even it might not take out the broader group that's loyal to.
Look, I don't know what his thinking is. I've been 2.5 years out from reading classified material on this, so I'm just speculating. I think targeting those zealots, the zealots in the regime, so maybe the IRGC, for instance, or the Quds Force, if you like, it's
the inner circle. Basically.
The inner circle. Look, it's a historical analogy. I don't want to take it too far, but imagine attacking the SS, the Waffen-SS, as opposed to the General German Army as a way of taking down Hitler. Yeah. That might be a model where you attack key parts of the regime and you leave maybe the police and the conventional forces alone and basically send signals through covert channels to say, look, we actually don't want to take down and take over your country. We just need the Ayatollahs gone. That might well be, I'm purely speculating, Trudy, that might well be the thinking.
Mike Pezzullo, really appreciate your insights as always.